Oh, Brian, this is still so troubling. Have we heard anything more from the family?
No, we haven't heard much. I mean, Savannah Guthrie hasn't released another video. She's obviously back in New York City now. She hasn't been back on the Today Show, but she hasn't been in Arizona from what I've been told. In terms of her sister Annie, who lives just a couple of miles away, she also hasn't said anything publicly. The last time that we saw her and Savannah was several weeks ago when they actually went out and visited the house and went and visited this memorial.
Somewhere between 9:50 p.m. and 2:28 a.m., something went terribly wrong. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet people trust. Streetlights glowing, doors locked, nothing out of place. Inside one of those homes, an 84-year-old woman was going about her night like any other. No alarms, no screams, no signs of chaos. And yet, by morning, she was gone. No clear struggle, no immediate answers, just a silence that didn't make sense. And now, weeks later, a question is beginning to surface, quietly, uncomfortably. Was this really a random crime? Or was this something closer to home than anyone wants to admit? Her name was Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, a mother, a grandmother, but also someone connected to a very public life. Her daughter, Savannah Guthrie, is a well-known television figure, a familiar face to millions. And while Nancy herself lived a quieter life, she wasn't completely out of the spotlight, which raises a question investigators still haven't answered. Was Nancy chosen because of who she was, or simply because she was vulnerable? Her home sat in the Tucson area, a place where neighbors felt safe, where something like this wasn't supposed to happen. She was last seen on the night of January 31st. By February 1st, she was reported missing. And from that moment forward, nothing about this case has felt normal. The first real sign that something was wrong didn't come from a witness. It came from a machine. Nancy had a bedside pacemaker monitor, something that quietly transmitted data every night, a routine, predictable, reliable, until it wasn't.
What is your gut telling you about the Nancy Guthrie case?
I would still go back and re-swab parts of that house and look for even like a rootless hair. We can solve these cases now with just a rootless hair. I find it very hard to believe the perpetrator didn't leave his DNA behind. We think he had that bite flashlight in his mouth, and I doubt he kept it in his mouth for the full 40 minutes or so that he was there. So as careful as he was to try to not leave his DNA, he would have taken that out of his mouth and he would have immediately had his DNA all over the outside of that glove, and he had to have touched something.
At exactly 2:28 a.m., the signal stopped. Not delayed, not interrupted briefly, stopped, as if something or someone had suddenly broken the pattern. That moment has become one of the most important clues in the entire investigation, because it suggests something critical. Whatever happened to Nancy happened right around that time, which leads to an even more unsettling thought. Who knew her routine well enough to act at exactly the right moment? Investigators began building a timeline, piece by piece, minute by minute. 9:50 p.m., Nancy is last seen. Everything appears normal. Then, hours pass. At 1:47 a.m., something unusual happens. Reports suggest a possible internet or electrical disruption at the home, not confirmed as intentional, but not easily ignored either. And then, 2:28 a.m., the pacemaker signal disappears. After that, nothing. No confirmed sightings, no verified movements, just a gap in time where an entire human being vanishes. Then came the footage. A doorbell camera captured something, someone outside that home that night. A figure, masked, covered, carrying a backpack. At first glance, it looked like the break everyone was waiting for. But the more people watched it, the stranger it became. The individual didn't move like a professional. There was hesitation, uncertainty. At one point, the person appears to search for something, anything to cover the camera. And what they choose feels almost random, not calculated, not precise, which creates a contradiction investigators haven't been able to resolve. Because everything else about this case suggests planning, timing the disruption, knowing when Nancy would be alone, acting in that narrow overnight window. That's not random, and yet the behavior on camera feels almost sloppy. So which is it? A carefully planned operation or someone in over their head? Authorities have been cautious. From the beginning, they've treated this as a kidnapping, not a confirmed homicide, not a random disappearance, a kidnapping. But even that label raises more questions than it answers, because typically kidnappings come with demands, contact, ransom, negotiation. In this case, silence. No clear communication, no outcome, which has led to a growing divide in how people see this case. Some believe it was random, a burglary gone wrong, an opportunistic crime. But others, they're not convinced. They believe this wasn't random at all, that Nancy was targeted, specifically, intentionally. And if that's true, then the most uncomfortable question of all begins to take shape. Not what happened, but why. Because targeting requires knowledge of the home, the routine, the vulnerability, and sometimes that kind of knowledge doesn't come from the outside, it comes from someone closer. Now, to be clear, there is no confirmed evidence pointing to anyone within the family, but the speculation exists, quietly, persistently. Some believe this crime may connect to personal motives, not just opportunity, and while those claims remain unproven, they continue to circle this case like a shadow. Because at the center of it all is a simple, haunting reality. An elderly woman vanished from her own home in the middle of the night in a neighborhood where nothing like this should happen. And despite weeks of investigation, we're still asking the same question. If this was planned, then who had a reason?
We received your message and we understand. We beg you now to return our mother to us so that we can celebrate with her. This is the only way we will have peace. This is very valuable to us, and we will pay.
Whoever entered that house didn't rush. That's one of the most unsettling details in the entire case, because according to investigators, the suspect may have been inside Nancy Guthrie's home for up to 40 minutes. 40 minutes inside a stranger's house in the middle of the night. That's not panic. That's not impulse. That suggests time, control, intent. And yet, almost everything else about this case feels chaotic. When investigators began analyzing the scene, a few details immediately stood out. There were small droplets of blood found along the walkway outside the home. Not a large pool, not a clear sign of a violent struggle, just droplets. Enough to confirm that something physical happened, but not enough to explain what exactly. Which raises a critical question. Was Nancy injured inside the home and then moved? Or did something happen outside? Even now, that detail remains unclear. Then there's the silence. No confirmed ransom call, no demand, no message. For a case being treated as a kidnapping, that absence is unusual. Because typically the purpose is clear, money. But here, nothing. Which makes investigators wonder, was this ever about ransom at all?
Are you actively investigating the son-in-law in this case? There were reports earlier this week and you refuted that. You said you haven't eliminated everybody. Have you eliminated him or come close to it, or are you actively looking at him?
We're actively looking at everybody we come across in this case. Everybody. We would be irresponsible if we didn't talk to everybody. The Uber driver, the gardener, the pool person, whoever, everybody. It's so cliche, but everybody's still a suspect in our eyes. That's just how we look at things and think as cops. Does that mean we have a prime suspect? No, and the family's been very cooperative. They've done everything we've asked of them, and we want that relationship to continue. And sometimes people can be mean out there, and that can really harm us and harm our efforts.
Another detail continues to stand out, that unexplained disruption around 1:47 a.m. Internet, possibly power. Authorities have not confirmed exactly what caused it, but they are looking into it. And the timing is hard to ignore, because it happens just before the pacemaker signal stops, almost as if something was deliberately disabled. If that's true, it changes everything. Because now we're not looking at a random intruder. We're looking at someone who may have planned ahead, someone who understood how to create a window where no one would see what was coming. But then the behavior doesn't match. The doorbell footage continues to confuse investigators. The suspect appears masked and prepared, carrying a backpack, possibly tools. But then small moments tell a different story. Hesitation, awkward movements. At one point, the suspect seems to improvise, grabbing an object to cover the camera in a way that feels almost careless. It doesn't match the idea of a highly skilled criminal. So now we have a contradiction. A person who may have planned the timing perfectly, but behaves like someone inexperienced once inside. This contradiction has opened the door to multiple theories, and online, the speculation has exploded. Some believe this was the work of a sexual predator, pointing to the idea that Nancy may have been attacked inside her bedroom, then removed to hide evidence, but there's no confirmed proof of that. Others believe it was a kidnapping attempt that went wrong, someone targeting an elderly woman expecting an easy ransom, only for the situation to spiral out of control. Then there's the insider theory, that someone who had access to the home or knowledge of Nancy's life may have tipped off the attacker, a worker, a visitor, someone who knew just enough. And while these theories vary, they all share one thing. They reject the idea that this was purely random. But there is one theory more controversial than the rest, one that has been circulating quietly online, a theory that points not to a stranger, but to someone within the family's orbit. More specifically, Nancy's son-in-law, Tommaso. Now, to be absolutely clear, there is no confirmed evidence linking him to the crime, no charges, no official suspicion from authorities. But the theory exists, and it centers around motive. According to speculation, Nancy may have been planning changes to her will, changes that could have impacted inheritance. And in that theory, timing becomes everything. Because if something happened before those changes were finalized, it could alter who benefits. Again, this is speculation, unverified, unproven. But it's a theory that some believe explains the level of planning and the personal nature of the crime. Because when you step back and look at the details, the timing, the possible system disruption, the knowledge of her routine, it starts to feel less random and more deliberate. But then the sloppy behavior returns, the strange movements, the awkward execution, and suddenly the theory doesn't fit as neatly. Which brings us back to the same question. Was this a carefully planned crime that went wrong, or a poorly executed crime that just happened to succeed? Because right now, it feels like both. And that's what makes this case so difficult to understand. Because if someone had inside knowledge, then this wasn't just opportunity, it was intention. And if that's true, then the person responsible didn't just find Nancy that night, they were already looking for her. Investigators are now saying something that changes the direction of this entire case. They believe Nancy Guthrie may have been targeted. Not random, not accidental, targeted. That statement didn't come lightly. It came after weeks of analysis, evidence, timelines, behavior patterns. And while officials are careful not to confirm a specific motive, they've made one thing clear. This wasn't a simple break-in. Because when investigators look at the details, the timing stands out. The suspect appears during a narrow overnight window, right after a possible system disruption, right before the pacemaker signal stops. That kind of precision suggests planning. So the question becomes, why Nancy? At 84 years old, living alone, she could be seen as vulnerable, an easy target for someone looking for a quick crime. But then there's another factor, her connection. Nancy wasn't just anyone. She was the mother of a nationally recognized television personality. And while she lived quietly, her identity wasn't completely private, which opens a different possibility. Was she targeted because of who she was connected to? One of the earliest theories was kidnapping for ransom. It would make sense. Target someone connected to wealth or public attention, demand money, disappear. But that theory starts to fall apart when you look at what didn't happen. No clear ransom demand, no communication, no negotiation, and weeks later, still nothing, which forces investigators to consider something else. If it wasn't about money, then what was it about? Another theory suggests burglary, a break-in that escalated unexpectedly. But again, the details don't fully support it. Nothing significant appears to have been taken, no signs of rushed theft, and the suspect stayed far too long for a typical burglary. So we're left with something more complex, a situation where the victim may have been chosen not for what she had, but for who she was, or perhaps for what she represented. And then there's the question of familiarity, because to pull off something like this, you would need to know certain things: the layout of the home, the timing of her routines, the fact that she was alone. These aren't things you always get from the outside. Sometimes they come from someone closer. Which brings us back to a theory that continues to circulate, quietly but persistently. The idea that this may have been staged, made to look like a kidnapping, when in reality the motive was something else entirely. Some believe this wasn't about money at all, but about timing, about ensuring that something happened before something else could change. Specifically, a will. According to online speculation, Nancy may have been planning to make changes that could affect inheritance, and in that theory, her disappearance wasn't random, it was strategic, designed to look like an abduction while serving a more personal motive. Some even point toward her son-in-law, Tommaso, as part of this theory. Again, there is no confirmed evidence supporting this claim, no official statement, no charges, just speculation. But it's a theory that continues to gain attention because of one reason: it attempts to explain the contradictions. Because if this was staged, then the strange behavior on camera might make sense. The sloppy movements, the awkward execution. It could be intentional, a performance, something meant to look like an inexperienced criminal. But there's a problem. Evidence. Investigators have found DNA at the scene. Mixed DNA, still being analyzed, and one piece found on a glove was traced back to a local worker with no connection to the crime, which complicates everything, because now we're dealing with contamination, multiple unknown contributors, and no clear match. So where does that leave us? With two competing possibilities. Either this was a targeted crime by someone unknown, or it was something staged by someone closer. Both explanations fit parts of the evidence, but neither explains everything. And that's what makes this case so unsettling, because every time it starts to make sense, something new appears and breaks the pattern. So we're left asking the same question again. If Nancy was targeted, then by who? And if this was staged, then what was the real motive hiding behind it? Because until that question is answered, every theory remains on the table, even the ones no one wants to believe. After weeks of searching, analyzing, and questioning, we're still missing the most important piece. Because no matter how you look at this case, something doesn't add up. In fact, several things don't. And the deeper investigators go, the more complicated it becomes. Start with the suspect. On camera, the individual appears almost careless. The movements aren't smooth. The behavior isn't precise. At one point, the suspect seems to struggle with something as simple as covering a camera. It feels unprofessional. Almost like someone who didn't fully know what they were doing. And yet, everything else about this crime suggests the opposite. The timing, the possible disruption of internet or power just before the disappearance, the narrow window between Nancy's last known activity and the moment her pacemaker signal stopped. That's not luck, that's coordination. So which is it? Someone sloppy or someone calculated? Because it's hard to be both. Then there's the blood. Small droplets found along the walkway. Not enough to clearly explain what happened, but enough to confirm that something physical took place. And yet, there's no body, no confirmed location, no clear trail. It's as if the evidence begins and then suddenly stops, leaving behind more questions than answers. Investigators have also been working through DNA evidence, and here's where things take another unexpected turn. A glove found near the scene contained DNA. At first, it seemed like a breakthrough. But the result, it traced back to a local restaurant worker, someone with no connection to Nancy, no link to the crime, just another dead end. And then there's the mention of mixed DNA, multiple contributors, still being analyzed, still unresolved, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the key piece of evidence is there, but buried among too many variables? And then the timeline, 40 minutes inside the house. That detail alone changes everything, because most crimes like this happen fast, in and out, minimal exposure. But here, the suspect stayed, moved around, took time. Why? What was happening during those 40 minutes? Was something going wrong, or was something being carefully carried out? Then there's the motive, or rather, the lack of one. If this was a kidnapping for ransom, where is the demand? If it was a burglary, where is the theft? If it was random, why this house? Why Nancy? Authorities have suggested that she may have been targeted, and if that's true, then the motive exists. We just don't know what it is. Which brings us back to the theories, because in the absence of answers, speculation fills the gaps. Some believe this was a random act, a desperate individual, an opportunistic crime that escalated too far. But others reject that completely. They point to the planning, the timing, the behavior that suggests familiarity, and they argue this wasn't random at all. Which leads back to the most controversial possibility, the idea that this could involve someone closer, someone who didn't need to guess, someone who already knew. Now, again, there is no confirmed evidence pointing to any family member, but the speculation exists, and one theory in particular continues to resurface, the idea that Nancy's disappearance may be connected to a personal motive involving inheritance, specifically claims that she may have been planning to make changes to her will, and that someone may have wanted to prevent that. Some online discussions even point toward her son-in-law, Tommaso, as part of this theory, suggesting the possibility that the crime was staged to look like an abduction. But it's important to be clear, there is no official evidence supporting this claim. No charges, no confirmation, only speculation. And yet, for some, it explains the contradictions, the mixture of planning and sloppiness, the lack of clear motive, the absence of a ransom. It creates a narrative where everything fits, but just barely, because there are still gaps, too many. If this was staged, then who was the person on camera? If it was targeted, then why hasn't a suspect been identified? If it was random, then how did it happen so cleanly? Even investigators seem to acknowledge the uncertainty. The sheriff himself has warned that the suspect could strike again, which suggests something even more concerning, that whoever did this may not be done. And so we're left here, weeks later, with no clear answers, just fragments, clues that almost connect, theories that almost make sense, and a case that refuses to resolve. Because at its core, it's not just about what happened that night, it's about understanding why. Why Nancy? Why that moment? Why that method? Was it a crime of opportunity, a targeted operation, or something far more calculated, hidden behind the appearance of chaos? And maybe the most unsettling question of all, are we looking in the wrong direction? Or have we been looking at the answer the entire time and just don't recognize it yet? Because until that missing piece is found, this story isn't over. Not even close.